And good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for joining today. We're just letting people, we just opened up the bridge, so we're just going to let people filter in, and we'll get started just at the top of the hour. Just stand by for a couple moments. Give people about another 30 seconds and we'll get started. Thanks everybody for joining today. Okay, great. We're going to get started now. As I mentioned, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Michael Rothschild. I'm the Vice President of Product at HYPR. We're pleased to have Simon Moffatt from the Cyber Hut with us today. And we're going to get into a nice beefy topic around cyber insurance, what the landscape is, and really the role of passwordless MFA as part of cyber insurance. Lots of detail here today. We have time for questions and answers, so please feel free to just click on that icon and we'll get to your questions and answers towards the end of the presentation. We're also recording this webinar, so if you miss any portion or if you find it particularly good and you'd like to share with a colleague, we will send you a link to the downloaded version of this after the webinar. So again, thank you so much for joining. Let's get started. So just to refresh, as I mentioned, I am the Vice President of Product here at HYPR, and Simon Moffatt is the founder and research analyst of Cyber Hut. Simon, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Michael. Yeah, hi everybody. Great to be here today. Super topic. I must say, I think it's been fortunate enough to have been in the identity space sort of best part of 20 years and seen all the technology changes and all the new fantastic ways we can solve identity challenges. And in that time period, there's been so many technological, economic process changes, and cyber insurance is one of them. Cyber insurance didn't exist 20 years ago, as many of you all will probably remember. So it's fascinating to see things like cyber insurance now become a real part of the modern enterprise's sort of risk arsenal. I work at the Cyber Hut now. I founded the Cyber Hut a couple of years ago, and we are independent analysts looking at the emerging technical and process trends within the broader identity and access management space, looking at research and doing analysis on the industry to see where we may be heading from an identity perspective. And it's great to be looking at some of these topics like cyber insurance today.
Yeah, Simon, thank you so much for joining. You're just such a wealth of knowledge when it comes to this kind of stuff, and specifically around cyber insurance. We've been hearing about it more and more, and there are specific rules and guidance around how you can get cyber insurance if you're looking at it for the very first time, or if you're looking to renew a policy, which we're seeing more and more. There are rules being written almost every day as to what you can get and how much it's going to cost and all kinds of other things. So a real beefy topic. Just to give you an idea in terms of the agenda, these are the three major things we want to cover today. Obviously the why, how, and what. Why there is an increasing demand for cyber insurance. Certainly security is not new to any of us, but cyber insurance is pretty new. We're going to talk about the how, specifically the role insurance plays to protect businesses like yours, and the what, how passwordless MFA can optimize insurance deployments. And we'll see in many cases, these insurance carriers are now requiring specific things such as MFA, in many cases passwordless MFA. So big beefy topic that we're going to cover within the next roughly 50 minutes. So Simon, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. It is such a big, broad topic, and I think the interesting thing is it's continually evolving as well, isn't it? I think it's certainly not stable and static. It's I think it's lots of volatility in cyber insurance, and I guess the first thing is the demand for this stuff is rising, and it's huge. A few numbers to get us going, I guess, set the scene a little bit. Global cyber insurance somewhere between 10 and 12 billion dollars. And growing pretty rapidly as well. I mean, put that in consideration, the global sort of car insurance market is about 90 or something. So it's still a little bit way to go, but I guess the car market has been around for a lot longer than the cyber market has, I guess. But these are really big numbers. And I think the fact that it is growing somewhere between sort of 16, 17, 18% sort of compound annual growth rate is real testament to that. Both the small, medium enterprises and the large enterprises are switching to cyber insurance as a real part of how they can cope with cyber threats, data breaches, lost credentials, cyber attack and cyber crime from a whole host of different areas. And I think that in itself is really rapid, and I think the change is rapid, the demand is rapid, and we're going to sort of head into some of the whys and the hows sort of shortly. But you know the cost of these things is going up and up and up. The cost of data breaches is going up. The cost of claims is going up. And this isn't for particular industry, is it? This is not just for the very elite, high-end sort of financial services organizations or one or two big healthcare providers. This is really hitting all sectors, online, offline, physical, those moving to a digital setting, small, medium sized. It's really affecting every single sector, which I think is real testament to probably some of these numbers here maybe being a little bit on the low side, as sort of market estimates always tend to be. But I certainly think we're now entering a situation where every organization really across every sector and every size of enterprise will be looking at least to research cyber insurance if they haven't got it already, and looking to see how they can use cyber insurance as part of their sort of countermeasure and defensive strategy. The why, why is suddenly cyber insurance in vogue these days? I think there's a real perfect storm, if you like, that's really driving some of the demand here. I think clearly we're in this era of changing business models. We're moving to doing things online. We have the metaverse coming in the next maybe 2 or 3 years, where we're going to be doing things in a digital twinning sort of world. So businesses have this increasing business model change. We have the volume and diversity of threats is increasing. We have hiring issues, trying to hire identity and access management personnel, cybersecurity personnel. That's really difficult. These are skilled job roles. It's very difficult to sometimes build a defensive cyber security posture without having the correct personnel. So we're starting to see meta trends which are really affecting every sector, if you like. But I guess two sectors which are really driven some of the large cyber insurance deals really is healthcare and financial services. And I guess looking at things like financial services, clearly we're seeing a huge rise in the digital delivery of online financial services, retail banking, shares, investment, insurance. Soon as you start to do stuff online, and I'm sure HYPR is the same really in this respect, the vast majority of your clients will be working in those fraud spaces, looking to reduce fraud, looking to enable digital solutions online. But unfortunately, cybercrime, it does follow successful digital delivery. The more you do online as a retailer or in financial services, you will attract adversarial activity, unfortunately. So suddenly you have this perfect storm of lots of stuff happening online, lots of adversarial activity, organizations perhaps not in the best defensive position to be able to counteract some of this stuff. I think this is adding to this need to transfer the risk elsewhere. And again, healthcare very similarly. There's more and more transactions being taken place online. The sharing of data, healthcare data between insurance entities, individuals, clinics, practitioners is becoming it's proliferating more and more. Clearly, the demand for healthcare doesn't stop. but we're doing this stuff online, and perhaps some of those processes and ecosystems are still maturing. And again, you can perhaps look at manufacturing as well, and retail and e-commerce. Very, very similar pattern of changing business complexity, but having to face up to the fact that there are some bad guys out there, and the adversarial activity can be quite difficult to defend against, I think. Um, let's introduce the topic, the how. How can organizations counteract some of this stuff? And there's an interesting graphic there on the left hand side from net diligence cyber claim survey from last year. And I think again there are multiple pieces of research out there looking at, you know, instant costs, the most popular instant, what's driving some of these cyber insurance claims. And the top two there typically are the ransomware, which is the top one, and typical generic hacker or adversarial activity is number two. They're difficult, complicated, diverse, evolving. It's really hard to say as an organization, I'm fully protected against something like adversarial activity or automated attacks or ransomware. It's hard to do that stuff. It's continually changing, much more complicated and automated than it was perhaps maybe even 2 or 3 years ago. And those threats are being pushed into typical risk management process. And most risk management processes, whether using NIST or ISO 27001 or the FAIR model of risk assessment, you're going to go through and you're going to look at all of these threats that are happening, all of your countermeasures, and somehow go through a risk treatment exercise. And unfortunately, many organizations are left looking to either mitigate or transfer that risk to somewhere else. They can't avoid the risk, they can't necessarily accept it, so they have to mitigate and pass this across to a third party. And this is really where we start to see insurance taking picking up the slack, as it were, for many organizations trying to cover the complex nature of their business. How can they protect against unknown threats? How can they protect against identity attacks, credential misuse, credential stuffing attacks, fraud, account takeover? It's very, very difficult sometimes to do that with existing technology. So this drive for insurance, I think, is going to continue. I don't see it stopping anytime soon. But I guess, Michael, pull you in here. You've got any sort of comments on that first little intro there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're saying is spot on. The fact is that whatever we do in security, there is always a changing threat matrix, right? The attack surface changes. Today, authentication is being attacked a lot more. As you mentioned, things with one-time passwords, passwords in general, man-in-the-middle attacks, password spraying using a special directory or dictionary of sorts. That attack surface is continuing to change. And at the same time, the attack vectors, the way people are getting in, are continuing to change. So I think you're spot on in terms of talking about the ability to transfer the risk someplace else. We know that any kind of downtime, we've known this for decades now, any kind of downtime or even impacted company operations translates to a direct loss. So the ability to transfer some of that risk to a third party, in this case, cyber insurance, where you don't suffer as much of a financial loss is definitely something that is near and clear, and certainly the customers and prospects we talk to are considering more than even 12 months ago.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. I think, and again, reiterate again, it's applying to every sector. It's every sector, small to medium-sized enterprises, the small shoe shop doing things online, right the way through to global financial services. I think it's impacting everybody. And I think, if you're an insurance company, you'll be looking at the next probably 5 years thinking this is a pretty big pipeline of activity you've got coming. I guess the other interesting for me, if we sort of skip on to the next one, is the different types of insurance available. And again, no different really to things like healthcare and car insurance and pet insurance. I guess we're starting to see, we're seeing the specialism out. We're seeing it iterate out into these different areas, which I think is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a whole bunch of different types of insurance you can buy. And these seem to be the four major ones that kind of rise to the top that we've seen insurance carriers really go after. One is the first one is around privacy. It's something that we read about all the time. I mean, I can remember over 10 years ago when we were talking about things like the breach to credit reporting and other things like that. But privacy insurance is specifically insurance that guards against any type of misused or stolen credentials. And in some cases, even you can write policies that are around compliance regulations, whether we're talking about in Europe, things around GDPR, or now California has a very similar type of regulatory issue with similar to GDPR or CCPA. You can get privacy insurance. Of course, we're very familiar with any types of network failures, whether it's due to ransomware or malware, other things. This is around security risk. Basically, if a security incident happens and there's some type of catastrophic failure, security risk will cover the business in the case of a network failure. When we look at other areas, you mentioned, Simon, retail, certainly it's true within critical infrastructure and other places where operations can be impacted. There are insurance policies you can buy around operational risk. And this is specifically when the operations, like a manufacturing or some type of service, has been impacted. If there is something that impacts your operations, there is a form of insurance you can get around operational risk. And then similarly, if you're a service-oriented organization, you can get a similar type of policy, which is a failure to provide a service due to security incident. So we've seen this early with carriers. If a carrier network goes down, or if an electrical provider goes down, there are insurance policies you can buy. And usually there's some type of miss and match here. You can choose specific policies, what you want coverage against, what you want coverage for, what you'd like to skip out on. So there is somewhat of a menu of the different types of insurances, and there are hybrids of this also, but these are the four that tend to rise to the surface. Now, at the same time, we talk about things like insurance and cyber insurance, guarding against risk. But as the backdrop for this, there is also a compliance/guidance element to this. And these are four bodies that perhaps you're very familiar with that are recommending specific ways of being able to, Simon, what you mentioned before, mitigating risk, right? Really reducing that risk. And whether we're looking at a national level here in the US, like the OMB, whether we're looking at things like CISA guidance, or even internationally like GDPR I mentioned earlier, there are specific guidance rules that they're coming out with. Now, in most cases, with the ones I have up on the screen here, it isn't a mandate. In other words, you're not going to get fined for not doing it. But the interesting thing with each of these specific regulatory bodies or guidance organizations, they are providing guidance around authentication. There are a couple of things that they're all saying. They're all mentioning around having an authentication process that is FIDO certified, and that's Fast ID Online. This is a body that is able to certify specific authentication risk and using a FIDO standard. We're seeing that a lot. In some cases, like with CISA and OMB, they're calling it the gold standard. And in other instances, specifically CISA and the FTC have mentioned that you not only need a FIDO-oriented type of authentication solution, but they're saying that phishing-resistant MFA is the way to go. Ensuring that whatever types of multi-factor authentication that you use, multi-factor authentication is great, but get to that next level and ensure the fact that whatever authentication that you use is phishing resistant. We're seeing this more and more within the regulatory and guidance community. And it's also something that cyber insurance carriers are picking up on when they're seeing organizations line up one behind the other and saying things around passwordless, FIDO, phishing resistant, they're beginning to build their policies to include that as a must-have as well. So
yeah, go ahead. That's really interesting. You say regulation is it's not you don't have to do it, but you're absolutely right. The insurance companies they pick up on that, don't they? Of course, and
absolutely,
yeah, that becomes the aspect there. It's as you said, things like NIST as well, the NIST guidelines. Very popular in describing how you should look after your identity ecosystem, and absolutely, these are not things you definitely should do, but they're such strong recommendations that the likes of third-party insurance entities will leverage that to say, well, actually, hang on, these are the sort of top things you should be working towards. And I guess if you're not, you need to have a really good reason as to why not. And I think that's really where that regulation angle certainly comes in. So, I mean, one thing I wanted to sort of pull up really is the optimization aspect. If you are an organization looking to maybe leverage insurance for the first time or looking to renew, certainly with those different types of insurance, it's going to be quite likely you'll be engaging insurance in some way, shape or form, whether it's privacy, operational, network, in some way, shape or form. And you're going to look to try and reduce premium first of all. And this is a bit like having a medical and a health check before you get your health insurance. It's exactly the same thing. You want to be able to leverage those existing defenses. It's still a relatively new market, cyber insurance. It's not got the 50, 60 years of history there with all of the modeling which is available. So pricing is volatile. A big data breach comes out tomorrow, for example, that could skew pricing again based on a particular tactic or technique or a particular vulnerability. So it's very volatile in pricing. So you want to be able to reduce premium, of course, leveraging your existing controls, leveraging, improving things like authentication and identity, which is already there. It just needs optimizing, of course. And claim payout, real big one, isn't it? If you do suffer a breach, I think unfortunately many organizations will, you want to be able to get a payout. And insurance companies, as we know, do a great job, but they don't necessarily want to pay out straight away. They want to investigate what's happened. Have you got controls in place? Are you leveraging strong MFA? Are you doing standard good practice around identity cleanup, using the best standards? Is your MFA strong coverage across all of the applications in your organization, not just maybe the high risk ones? So looking to reduce the claim power is obviously a big problem. So you need to be able to have a bigger breadth, if you like, of things like strong MFA against as many users, against as many systems as possible there. So it's looking to consolidate those existing MFA components, essentially looking to remove some of those I guess legacy ways which the likes of NIST and others talk about, things like SMS one-time passwords and such like that. How can that be removed and consolidated? How can you increase adoption of the passwordless components? Can you protect both workforce and consumer? Can you protect that whole user community and not just subsets of those user communities? And try and be future-proof, because I think clearly in the cyber world things are changing daily, but that then will filter through either via regulation over a couple of years. But I think in the volatility of pricing within cyber insurance will react to some of those future events. So putting in an authentication framework and control set which can be future-proof to an extent, I think will go a long way to not only reducing premiums, but I think also giving confidence to your insurance contractor and underwriter that you are in a strong position as an organization.
Yeah, I guess the notion is that if you're just doing checkbox, the insurance companies won't always pay. There is one specific instance, I think it was in Q3 of last year, where one specific insurance carrier, there was one of their clients that were breached, that they were covering on cyber insurance, and when they did the post-mortem and they saw what the actual coverage was, what the breach looked like, they didn't pay out because it was a checkbox. They had passwordless MFA or some type of MFA in one area, but it didn't cover the entire organization, and they in effect did not pay out. And Simon, one of the things that you brought up, I think is really interesting. If we take a step back and we look at what people have done, and this really goes to your standardization comment, is over time we realized that the password was not enough. In fact, passwords were originally made to reserve mainframe time on computers. You put in a user ID and password, and you knew you had a certain amount of time on that mainframe. And we kind of adopted it as being the authentication method of choice, right? And when we realized that that was not enough to secure stuff, we had these great hard tokens that we all carried on our key ring. And then after that, when we realized that wasn't enough and people were breaching the one-time passwords, we moved to push authentications. And when we saw problems with that, specifically around SIM swapping and other things like that, we added another layer of security, like number matching. And the numbers that you see, the stats that I have here on this slide, really shows that we've added a lot of complexity to the password, but we really haven't solved the problem of authentication security. The fact that 89% of organizations in a study that HYPR performed, that 89% had a phishing attack in the last year. And there are credential stuffing attacks that we talked about before, and the push fatigue is happening. We start to have to question, and the insurance companies are questioning whether the password is really the way to go, or are we just adding additional layers on with the hope that something is going to change? And that's really why organizations are looking at other MFA mechanisms that are out there. Let's call them next gen for a moment. And that's why insurance carriers are mandating this type of thing. So we've used the term quite a bit, or I've used the term around phishing resistant MFA. These are the things, as I mentioned before, that CISA, OMB, GDPR, all these organizations are requiring. So the what I want to go back to for a second. What is phishing resistant MFA? And I wanted to give one example here, and I think it touches, Simon, on a couple of things we were talking about, which is that completeness of vision, right? You really have to, if you're doing phishing resistant MFA, it needs to be everywhere. And in many organizations, I know certainly in our organization, we have some Windows users, we have some Linux users, we have some Apple users, we have people on iOS, we have people on Android, we have people using SSO, all kinds of different things. That phishing resistant MFA must solve for all of those platforms. It's not that you just choose one or two platforms and you're good enough. And the way we typically recommend phishing resistant MFA to work is, you can see on the left-hand side of your screen, we turn your smartphone into a FIDO token. And what exactly that means is that you will always keep the private key on your phone in the secure enclave or TPM, depending on what kind of phone you have. And the public key is stored in the cloud. And this really changes things. You no longer have a password. You no longer have any shared secrets. There's nothing to steal at this point. There's nothing to phish at this point anymore. And that idea, Simon, that you mentioned before, that completeness is something that is just really important. I mentioned that the private key is stored on each individual's phone, and there's huge advantage there. If we think about the hacker and the security community, right? They're almost divergent areas, they're almost exact opposites. Security only has to be wrong once for a hacker to get in. Only has to be wrong once, and the hacker can get in. The idea behind this is that if I have a database over here on the left-hand side, the way authentication used to work with it, we're storing all of our keys in a central database. That's where we see these colossal breaches coming from. If we think about, the credit reporting agencies, the social media platform, anything that we can think of in recent memory, that hacker just has to be right once. And if they can get to that database, they have everybody's credentials. What we're really changing we're changing the economics of an attack with phishing-resistant MFA. Instead of having that database, there is no database with these private keys anymore. Instead, those private keys are stored on each individual's smartphone or even hardware token. It's stored there. So the hacker, in order to have a successful attack in passwordless MFA or in phishing-resistant MFA, they have to literally go to every person's smartphone or other device and hack there. So it's just not an economically feasible way of going in. It's not worth the hacker's time. They're going to move on to greener pastures and move away from this. So when we talk about phishing-resistant MFA, it's really about changing the economics of the attack. Now, one of the other things that I mentioned earlier was around one-time passwords, and a lot of people use one-time passwords, right? This is that push to your phone. As you can see, I have an example here on the left-hand side of the screen where you get a one-time password that is usually sent by a text or other methodology, could be email, and you enter that one-time password. It's only good for once. But we're still seeing a lot of cases where there can be SIM swapping, or what we've seen more recently is what we call either push fatigue or push bombing or password replays, where we've seen attacks recently where you'll get inbound texts or emails saying, will you allow this? Or here's your one-time password. And that password can be sent or intercepted by a hacker. So we're seeing a lot more of these push fatigues, push bombings, man-in-the-middle attacks, et cetera. So one of the things that we recommend, and again, insurance companies are looking at this more than ever before, is what we see on the right-hand side of the screen, which we call user-invoked authentication. Rather than you getting a one-time password, rather than the operation of authentication starting on the server side, you can see here that we're starting it on the user side. So the question that comes up, and this is just one example, is do you want to complete this authentication as the user? And you can choose to either log in or deny. So that user-invoked authentication will really curtail, if not fully eliminate, these different types of attacks when the user is not invoking that authentication operation. So what we put together here were just some of the ideas and some of the things that cyber insurance is looking for in terms of a checklist and things you should keep in mind as the ultimate consumer when you look at different types of authentication mechanisms and when you're considering different types of solutions that will help not only your security, but help you get the best rate possible, helps you write the policy when it comes to cyber insurance. A couple of things here, and we do have downloadable versions of this that we are happy to share with you, so you can start to make the right choices. Some of the things we want to, and I'm not going to go in any particular order here, but I'm going to call a couple of things out, and Simon would love to hear any commentary behind this. But obviously, bare bones, no passwords, no shared secrets. We see in a lot of instances where there are solutions providers out there that will say, you don't have to put in a password, you don't have to put in a shared secret, but in fact, you may be using a biometric, which in fact sends that password or shared secret. So when we say no passwords, no shared secrets, we truly mean none, that there's nothing happening on the back end. There are great frameworks that are out there. We didn't talk a ton about it, but there are frameworks like Zero Trust. There are frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK, which, by the way, just yesterday, CISA put out some guidance around looking at that MITRE ATT&CK for authentication and start to align your solution with something like that. Look for those frameworks, because that's really a best-in-class approach that is evolved across many organizations over a period of time. Simon, one of the things that I love that you mentioned is around future-proofing, right? It's enough that we have to fit stuff into what's happening today. It's hard enough to find a solution that's going to work well without locking you in. So you really want to find a solution today that doesn't lock you into a particular technology. Even though you're very happy with that technology today, obviously things change. We know an internet lifetime is maybe 3 years at best. You want to make sure that it works with your existing technology. And if you have to make a change in your SSO, in your firewalls, or God knows what else, even your programming platforms, you want to make sure that that passwordless solution will work with whatever you put in next. And conversely, at the same time, we know attack surfaces change, right? We might not have been talking as much about push bombing or SIM swapping, these types of things 24 months ago. Obviously, that attack surface has changed. So you not only want to have something that is forward compatible within your environment when things change there, but also as attacks change. And then the one other thing I want to add in is that notion that I mentioned earlier of completeness of vision, right? When we talk about authentication, the first thing that we tend to go to is, I need to authenticate to my SSO, or I need to authenticate to a specific application. What we sometimes don't think about is the fact that I have to authenticate to my VPN, or I have to authenticate to my virtual desktop, or I have to authenticate to my computer that I boot up every day. This passwordless MFA, this phishing resistant MFA, should scale from your desktop to the cloud and everything in between. Think about all of the things that you have on your computer today. Secured files, cached passwords, even within your browser, you might be caching passwords you don't even realize. So the idea of having that completeness of vision, to be able to see everything, have the solution work everywhere. And Simon, as you mentioned before, both for your workforce and for your customers, is really key to deploying the solution that makes the most sense for you.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the biggest thing that I hear is this completeness of vision. I think many organizations have authentication solutions across their entire landscape, and clearly usernames and passwords unfortunately still exist, but many organizations, they have invested in some MFA somewhere, whether it's OTP, whether it's dongles, whether it's keys, or whatever it could be. So the enterprise is often a bit of a mismatch, isn't it? It would often have multiple different systems in play, different levels of maturity, different levels of security and usability, and they are desperately looking to consolidate that into one strong passwordless approach, or one strong MFA for them all. So absolutely, they want to have a coverage issue resolved. Really, they don't want to have 10 different ways of logging in, dependent on perhaps who you are, which system you're trying to access, the level of risk associated with that. That really needs to be collapsed into a single approach, which covers as many systems as possible. And as you mentioned, those existing identity provider infrastructures are probably going to be there for quite a long time, whether it's Azure or cloud or ForgeRock, Okta, or whoever. Integrate against those, leverage the coverage those IDPs have, bolt into those existing single sign-on capabilities to try and have the same strong passwordless experience across as many systems as possible. Not only does that increase usability and happiness, which is very important, but there's a huge operational angle there as well. There's a consolidation aspect. Operationally, it's simpler, which means it's more secure, and also it's cheaper, it's more productive. So there's a whole host of benefits there, and I think organizations are now, they're understanding that's the driver. And one of the things we get hit up on quite a lot is things like authentication assessments. And we as analysts and news vendors and consultants, they all talk about, we need to get rid of the password. And in honesty, most people agree, most large enterprises agree. Ourselves as consumers of services want to move away from passwords, but it can be difficult. It can be hard. And I think the first thing that we sort of recommend, really, especially in the eagle eyes of cyber insurance these days, is to have some sort of authentication assessment in there. Identify where passwords are being used without MFA. Get that documented, which systems, how many users, why is MFA not in place? Then start to sort of build out the matrix of different authentication modalities, which MFA components are being used, leverage a security versus sort of usability matrix, and work out, where can we consolidate? Where can we get rid of the SMS one-time password? Where can we get rid of expensive dongles, or whatever it could be, legacy approaches? identify that high risk, and then look to obviously migrate that onto something more future proof. So, cyber insurance companies, they are desperately wanting to have clients who are safe, secure, usable, and future proof. I think that the only real key way to do that is remove some of that complexity, collapse that into a much simpler way of handling authentication. And I think really taking ownership of that journey of moving from passwords, maybe adding in some MFA, consolidating that into a strong MFA, and then obviously hopefully getting rid of passwords entirely is definitely within reach, I think, now for many organizations.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things is, as we know, being in security for some time, you have these different silos, of authentication. I think the average is that people have an average of somewhere around 26 different login passwords just for work, right?
Yeah.
And the idea of having so many different things, it certainly is a user experience type of thing. But also these silos are rife for having security incidents just fall between the cracks, right? If you're using many different authentication systems or using many different security systems in general, those silos can sometimes shadow or obfuscate an attack that's happening just simply because there are so many in process that you can't make heads or tails of them. So yeah, totally. So I wanted to talk just for a couple of minutes. We've spent a lot of time talking about risk and risk reduction. And I just wanted to provide, there are very compelling reasons to reduce risk. And you can see here that if you move to a passwordless MFA or a phishing resistant MFA, you can see a 98.4% reduction in things like account takeovers and phishing and stuff like that. But Simon, what you've alluded to is really something that is additional payoffs that we don't necessarily always think about, and where you have additional ROI. There really is some substantial value drivers beyond just reducing risk, getting the cyber insurance you need, being covered, and all that stuff. User satisfaction is a huge thing. That whole frictionless experience is amazing. When I log in the morning, I log into my computer, it logs in once with my biometrics, passwordless, and I'm good for the day if my risk profile doesn't change. Think about your users, whether they're internal workforce users or customers. Customers are now used to passwordless. In many cases, they're logging into their personal phones just by looking at that or by using their fingerprint. They're used to it. And that user experience is attracting customers. We've spoken to, I can think of one specific customer that we work with where they said that they're actually using it as a recruiting mechanism. When they have employees that are or candidates that are looking to become employees, this sometimes comes up where they see how the systems are so easy to use, and it helps close the deal in some cases. We're also seeing the reduction in things like help desk calls for password resets. It's amazing that one particular customer that we were able to quantify this with experienced overall 35% fewer help desk calls for, I forgot my password, I need to reset my password, you never gave me a password, things like that. And that's overall help desk. In terms of just password resets and stuff like that, we've seen an upwards of 95% reduction in calls. And what this really, in this specific instance that I'm talking about, it was over $2.4 million in savings for incident response per incident. They just reduced the amount of attack investigations and tech investigations and response. You're lowering the numbers here. So great added bonus where you're not only dealing with just the insurance aspect, but also hard dollars. And then finally, for those that are in operations, for those that are on the risk side, the ability to show forward-leaning compliance and things like GLBA, SOX, HIPAA, SOC, whatever. Doesn't matter what industry you're in anymore. There's an alphabet soup of regulatory compliance standards that you need to be able to handle, and to have that forward-leaning reporting, that proactive response can also save it in cost. So it's not a one and done thing where it's just about cyber insurance or reducing costs in the help desk or making people happy, but there is a basket of good things of ROI, of value drivers that can really help push this initiative forward within your organization. So we covered a lot, Simon, didn't we? So just to remind everybody, we are open for questions and answers. We did want to provide a couple of follow-up items here. You have both Simon's contact information. Follow him. He's got great stuff that comes out regularly, Simon. I always read your stuff and I always learn something new. You know, just when I think I can't learn something new, I learn something new. So thank you for putting out the great content. So you have Simon's information, you have HYPR's information, my own information there. And we did want to give you a bunch of calls to action or things that you can access if you want to learn more. Simon, the CyberHUD, put together a great buyer's guide for passwordless technology, really good information there, as well as inquiry services. Simon, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about what you offer from your inquiry services and that type of thing, but would love to hear.
Absolutely. You know, authentication is so pervasive nowadays. It's, you know, we get inquiry around things like understanding the market, understanding things like the checklist, you know, going through how can you identify risk within your authentication landscape, looking at sort of reviewing architecture decisions that organizations have made, and trying to understand this sort of complex landscape of things like FIDO, FIDO2, and really trying to provide that enablement and value around this pretty exciting market, really. So the inquiry services are, you know, pretty standard for us, really, working with either CISOs or sort of high level within that buy side community to understand more really around what's happening in this space. So it's pretty fast moving, but we try and keep the finger on the pulse a little bit.
Excellent. So I also have added a couple of follow-up documents. It includes things around the state of authentication. We did this study, which was a roundup from 2022. What does the state of authentication look like for financial services industries? We also just released one that is specific to the UK. So if you're in the UK or in Europe, that might be interesting for you. We have some banking success stories. And if you just want to see how passwordless MFA works, we can certainly set you up with that. We'd be happy to share that with you. So Simon, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, just taking a look at any questions that we have here. And we will, let me just look through here. Okay, just a side question. Will the presentation be sent out after the session? The answer is yes. You'll get that and the recording, no problem. Simon, there is a question here. I have my own answer, but I'd be curious to hear a non-biased, non-vendor question here. What does it tend to look like in terms of cyber insurance? Is there any type of uplift between, you know, previous years and current year premiums that you can talk to?
Well, that's a good one. Yeah, I think there is volatility, I think, in the whole cyber insurance deployment model, if you like, which I think is, I don't see it stabilizing too soon. I think clearly everything we've been mentioning for the last 45 minutes, I think will go somewhere, certainly in providing a consistent premium across different cyber insurance providers if you are in that position. So you go through and say, look, you know, we are working towards NIST and GDPR or whatever it could be, and we do have a framework in place or a plan in place to remove passwords or, you know, leverage passwordless, for example. All those things are absolutely super ways of being consistent. I think year on year, I think we are still seeing volatility, unfortunately, which is why I think things like, you know, the easy pickings of strong MFA really do help the enterprise in getting that consistency there. But I mean, yeah, what's your sort of view on that one?
Yeah, so it's interesting. We're seeing two distinct things. We're seeing insurance premiums, people that had it before that have gone up as much as 50%. And so we're seeing hard costs like that. We're seeing in some cases organizations that never had cyber insurance before that are looking to pull out a policy, and it's a requirement. You know, similar to like if you have homeowners insurance, certain homeowners policies will not cover you unless you have smoke detectors in your house. So it's a base requirement in some cases now. So we're definitely seeing a combination of both premium increases as well as absolute musts that are out there.
Yeah, and you know, again, to amplify that, I think as well, it's not so much saying, you know, the cyber insurance company expects organizations to have everything fixed, because that's a very difficult thing to do. But the fact that we see so many data breaches, which are typically related to things like breach credentials, credential stuffing, brute force attacks, like they're all identity related. I think that sort of becomes standard terminology, standard language, standard associations for the non-technical community. I guess, you know, we're all sort of embedded within the identity space, so we sort of assume that's the case. But you know, even today, I was posting yet another breach by an organization, and it was to do with credential stuffing. So the more those sorts of things happen in the sort of common press, the more insurance companies will say, well, actually, hang on, look, why have you not got MFA? Why are you not moving towards it? And yeah, I think that will not help premium reduction at all, I don't think.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to answer this question. Simon, if you could just look at the questions while I answer this one, we'll both take one more, and then we'll call it. So there's a really good question here. Can you speak a bit more to the model you described, where an end user logs in once in the morning, and then you do not have to log in again as long as their risk profile does not change? Would there be no additional logins throughout the day, or is this determined by policies that an organization can set? So great question here. I'll try and give a short answer, and Lindsay, if I don't fully answer your question, just ping me on my email. But basically, this is a policy that can completely be written by the organization. What tends to happen, what we see in most organizations, I will log in to my computer. I will provide my biometrics, and it will do the passwordless login. And the first step that I take is I go and boot up my SSO. And the fact that I booted up my SSO right away thereafter, it takes that authentication and it can pass that authentication to my SSO. Now, having said that, you can set any kind of policy you want. So for instance, I may set a policy that if 10 minutes have elapsed since my last authentication, re-authenticate. Or if my risk profile has changed, you know, I just logged in from New Jersey, and why am I logging in from Canada? You know, 20 minutes later, it's a location type of policy where if something doesn't look right, it may require step-up authentication or something else. You can pretty much choose anything, but we allow just one authentication. But having said that, it's also based on risk and based on company policy. So it is very extensible as how an organization wants to use it in terms of time, in terms of risk factors, all of these types of things. Simon, anything there that you see?
Yeah, we've got time for one quick one here, which is, well, it might be a quick question, it could be a long answer, I guess, but what role, what other role does IAM, identity and access management, have in the sort of cyber insurance landscape? Well, clearly authentication is a significant part of that, but I think, you know, identity now is so pervasive, and I think, you know, the cyber insurance landscape, they are looking for things like increased assessment, risk assessment around identity and visibility of identity, which I think has always been something organizations have struggled with, which doesn't necessarily mean you need to go and do something proactively. It means you need to understand your landscape. Where are your identities? Which identities? Consumers, contractors, workforce, third parties. Which systems are they logging into? How are they logging into those systems? What authentication mechanisms? You know, which permissions have been provisioned to them? Which permissions are they using? And things around, you know, disabling accounts that haven't been logged in for 90 days. Quite basic stuff, risk-based things, I think are very important when it comes to identity, and simply having identity risk management processes in place, being able to document, being able to provide visibility. And I think that by design allows you to do two things. One is identify high risk and be actionable upon that, but then at least you can ensure third parties that, look, we are in control, we are looking at our identity ecosystem. we're looking for the risk, and we have a plan to mitigate some of that.
Good stuff. Simon, I always learn something from you every time. So really, thank you for joining the webinar today. I also like to thank all of our listeners for joining. We do this on a monthly basis, so we hope to see you back on future webinars. And of course, if you have any questions offline, you have our contact details. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining and have a good rest of the day.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Michael.